So today we're looking at the question of social change. That's kind of like where we are in our rubric, is servant leaders connected to the idea of having some sort of concrete impact for social change in the world. It's not just like ideas and like happy circles that we sit in, but the idea is to actually be able to implement this. And we were looking at that within context of the question of what does it take, what are the hard considerations and what are the limitations that we need to consider, discern, work our way through when enacting change, especially when it comes to engaging something that is forceful. What is an appropriate, a responsible, a practical reckoning of force when you need it. So to start that, I thought I would open with this quote from Oscar Romero. It's from his book, The Violence of Love. "A church that doesn't provoke any crisis, a gospel that does not unsettle, a word of God that does not get under anyone's skin, a word of God that does not teach the real sin of society in which it is being proclaimed. What gospel is that? Very nice, pious considerations that don't bother anyone. That's the way many would like preaching to be. Those preachers who avoid every thorny matter so as not to be harassed, so as not to have conflicts and difficulties, do not light up the world they live in." So we thought that was a good kind of guiding question about how to engage force. And the reason why we think this is really important is because we're talking about servant leadership this semester and we're exploring it in the world of human conflict. So we're kind of looking at the horizon in which groups come together and clash, sometimes forcefully. And the thing about being a prophet that we talked about earlier is that prophets not only rise up in situations of conflict, but they bear a message about change, and that's one that's not often nice to be received. It's not well met. And so not only do they rise up in situations of conflict, but oftentimes their message and their presence is what generates conflict to begin with. And therefore, in order to be prophetic, we need to think responsibly through how to engage conflict ahead of time, because if that's part of the mission, we need to be responsible with engaging it. So for today, we're going to look at how to go about pursuing concrete change when engaged in work that creates conflict and sometimes responds to violent conflict, and how to ethically kind of look at that. We're going to be looking at two historical figures who have worked as part of movements that have had a concrete impact on reshaping the world around them. And though never fully realized, their work has marked historical turning points. So there is an aspect of concrete change, but then there's also the question of how you go about engaging that concrete change. And I think the important thing to look at is not just theoretically, but how that plays out historically. It's not just to have an idea about what we're committed to, but also to recognize the historical context, the situations, the parameters, the opportunities, and the limitations which they hold for our ability to move, and the options and places to navigate that are available to us. So the two figures that we're looking at, they have varied methods. One of them was nonviolent, and one engaged violence through use of force. And the goal for today is not to discern who was right, but to examine the factors, the realities, and the context that shaped the situations they were engaged in and the options that were available to them. It raises the reality that in asking how to pursue change, there's not really a standard answer that we can always put into every situation. So we need to think through how to start reckoning with the demands that are presented to us. And it makes us ask the hard questions of ourselves as servant leaders, trying to respond prophetically to the conflicts of our experience and our world, and how do we try to reckon with the question of violence. I think it's also important to recognize there's not only the historical factors and the context, because that is really the parameters of everything we operate in, it's also the roles that we hold, and how is the difference between being a person, being part of a community, and being a representative and a leader change the different demands and the ways we think through these things. Is what I do as an individual the same thing that I can do when I'm representing other people? And I think the heart of it is the question of how do we individually, as people sitting in this room, start responding to that? Like, what do you do if you think about it? And And I invite you to think about it, like when you're at home and someone enters into your house, what's your reaction? Like, what do you do? How does that change if it's not you who's kind of the target of potential violence, but what happens when it's your little sibling, someone that you care about, someone that you love? What happens when you're not necessarily directly involved in it, but you're watching something play out? And how does that kind of change depending on whether it's an individual level or a larger communal level? So those are some of the questions that we're looking to raise today. Yes.
Okay, so I'm here to kind of bring out and talk about our first example of the way to explore this idea of where our prophetic call, right, our gospel call, interfaces with conflict on this semester's theme within that social plane, right, on the social political elements between groups, between nations, between citizens and groups. Our first example is going to be coming out of the context and the history of South Africa and apartheid, which even if we talk the entire Service Council, we could not do full justice to, but just setting up that as the context, just understanding that after World War II in 1948, apartheid was set up as institutional segregation, and the discrimination and violence that followed that actually continued to escalate in the years that followed. By the time there's 1970, all African or black members of South Africa their citizenship was kind of revoked, and the right to vote was even revoked. So throughout the last half of the 20th century, you're seeing this apartheid as institutional violence in many ways, because if people were actually to act on or try to reinforce their own human dignity or those in favor of them, it was put down rather violently or in such a way that is nothing short of oppression. So as we come to the end of the 1980s, you see throughout that entire period that there's always internal struggles and conflicts, just much like our own understanding of the civil rights movements or anti-slavery movements, all struggles, right, that are voicing of the prophetic call for human dignity, for healing. Because if we go back to Greenleaf's idea of what a prophet is, right? What's the prophet? A prophet is the person whose idea, if implemented, is a means to healing, right? A means to healing. So out of this context, we see that leaders of the African National Congress and so forth during this period, like particularly Nelson Mandela, had to face down, what do we do in response to this violence, this institutional and structural violence, this negation of human dignity? Do we actually embrace violence? Or do we take the peaceful path moving forward? They continually made the choice to be a peaceful movement through all that. And there's a lot of factors today we'll hopefully unpack to help us understand a little bit more why that was even an option or why that was the best option to kind of take. We'll discuss in our discussions. But shortly after the Cold War ends and the tensions between the capitalist West and the communist kind of East or Eastern Europe kind of that breaks apart, and the dimensions that kind of held the political relations and international relations of the world in these two categories for such a long time ended. South Africa, people were able to turn to South Africa because the communist movements were also in the Soviet Union were trying to spread throughout all of Africa as well, and the United States and the West and NATO were trying to counteract that. So there's these tensions, but when that ends, then they're able to, the West and the United Nations and so forth can turn their attention to sort of structural and institutionalized violence that's been taking place in other places, particularly South Africa. So why am I mentioning that? Because the entire time while there's internal struggles that are going on, while there is violence, while there are deaths, while there is a great deal of issues going on, and the decision is still to remain peaceful and nonviolent through that process as much as possible by the leaders of the black Africans, South Africans. You see that it's when international pressure was also brought to bear that things really start to accelerate and change. Even the tensions and kind of violence that in that process of negotiations from 1990 to 1993 to end apartheid, there was still a great deal of violence. There was sort of even black on black violence, the black on the white violence, and that helped in some ways to really even accelerate the issue and what needed to be done. To the point where you get 1994, where there's free and open elections because now there's universal suffrage. Everyone now has the right to vote. And so the majority of South Africans can now have a government that's representative of themselves that can protect and promote their own dignity and needs. So out of that, though, at that point in history, you have something that is really, really challenging and tenuous, this transition from one oppressive regime to another. And you see in history there's this tendency for the oppressed to become the oppressors. With South Africa, Nelson Mandela made a different choice. They made a choice that we want to highlight as something to be held up as an example and something very, very powerful to look at and to have as a witness. And Nelson Mandela asked when he was president for Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who had been very active through this entire period, and we can't necessarily go into that, to come out of retirement, to not retire, and to head up the government's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so what we want to look at is the fact that this was a choice to approach social justice from an angle of restorative justice as opposed to punitive justice. Right? Restorative justice is looking at models of reconciliation, of healing, of an idea of justice as right relationship. And there's a different idea of the human person built into that, right, that our faith calls us to. If we understand ourselves truly to be brothers and sisters, to be part of one mystical body that is referred to as the body of Christ, then that interconnection is something that we cannot deny and that we need to work within and recognize as a part of who we are as human beings and what we need to flourish fully as human beings. Restorative justice is a means to that. And we're going to show a YouTube clip that will unpack a little bit about the process that took place during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Desmond Tutu's role in it. And there's some key things I hope you hone in on that we'll kind of unpack as we come on our way out. But what's so novel, right, is it's different than punitive justice. It's not this idea that justice is basically paying your debt. But in order to pay your debt, we're actually going to, and we would never acknowledge this in the United States, but paying the debt means we're going to have more suffering. Now you have to suffer, we're going to punish you in order for this justice to be done, right? So there's this individual idea, this deadness idea of what justice is that takes out the idea of what it means to be reconciled and healed and a fuller humanity, a fuller human being and human experience coming out of conflict, coming out of violence. So that's where our prophetic call asks us to go, right? And today we're going to explore that, and we're also in our second part, led by Irene, going to explore why that's an exceptionally challenging thing. But in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we see nonetheless, even though it is a hard choice, it is one that ultimately leads to the greater, higher good, and because it's based on the fact that, as Desmond Tutu says, this is a moral universe, and justice is always unfolding, and so the idea of justice and healing between oppressor, oppressed, victim, and offender is something that ultimately brings the greater good and greater healing. So is this booted up? You can pause it for a second until we get it going. Hopefully you guys can see this. At the very least, we just want to pump up the volume.
Desmond Tutu's contribution to South Africa did not stop here. He had planned to leave his home in Cape Town and retire to America and spend time with his grandchildren. But then, Nelson Mandela asked him to lead the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was a request that the Archbishop could not turn down.
It heard from the victims of apartheid and heard the stories of the victims, which was an enormously emotional process.
Nokle Mohapi was the first to take the stand. Her husband, Mapetla, died in custody 20 years ago. The authorities claimed it was suicide. I want help, she said. I want the truth because I know that my husband never killed himself.
Desmond Tutu knew that without confronting the past, South Africa could not move forward, and he wanted to hear from all those affected by apartheid.
The Archbishop was very keen to hear, as he said, the stories of the little people, not necessarily the big famous stories about which there was already considerable evidence, but stories of people in small towns, in faraway places whose suffering had been ignored for so long.
Mary Burton worked with Desmond Tutu throughout the commission and sat with him through all the testimonies.
It was an enormous task. There were altogether close on 22,000 statements made to us in those years.
And then he fell down on the pavement and he died about half an hour later.
It was often very heartbreaking, the sheer magnitude of the suffering and the repeated stories and the fact that so many people had been ignored and suffered in silence for so long. I think everybody who was part of the Truth Commission was changed by it to some extent.
Desmond Tutu himself was deeply affected by the stories he heard.
He responded within the first day or two by breaking down at one stage. And after that, he got upset with himself and discussed it with Leah and said, this shouldn't be about me. This should be about the victims. I'm going to take attention away from the victims unless I can learn to control my emotions. And thereafter you would see him biting his hand like that when he was getting emotional to ensure that the focus remained on the victims.
The Holy Spirit calmed the turmoil within.
The commission was a government initiative and not overtly religious, but the fact that the Archbishop was the chair did have a significant influence.
We discussed in the Commission's meeting whether the Archbishop should wear his purple robes at the hearing, and the majority view was that he shouldn't. And we said so really quite strongly. This is not a religious commission. And the Archbishop listened to all of these arguments, and then he said that the people want it. And he was quite right. The people, particularly the victims who were testifying, whether they were Christian or not, they wanted to shake his hand. They wanted to be touched by him. His presence was important to them. And his purple robes lent a solemnity to the occasion that I think was very important. So he had that sense of what people wanted and what people needed and what he could give to them.
Despite the fact that terrible crimes were being recalled, forgiveness, something at the heart of Christianity, was central to the Commission's aims.
The reservatory for this commission is opening wounds, cleansing them so that they do not fester, and saying we have dealt with our past as effectively as we could. We have not denied it. We have looked the beast in the eye.
I think we all learned a great deal during the Commission about forgiveness, about how you reach it, about the fact that most people don't reach it, about the fact that even if you do it once, you actually have to, in a way, keep on and on forgiving if you want to be healed and be sane after terrible suffering.
One of the things that the Archbishop made very clear was the fact that forgiveness is not easy. And he would often say that you are in love with your wife, you do something wrong, and even in the privacy of your bedroom, it is hard to say, I'm sorry. And here we are asking people publicly, in the glare of television cameras, to say sorry for a very horrendous deed. And the Archbishop was just trying to show that forgiveness is not cheap.
You led the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You got those people who've been tortured to face those people who have done the torturing and presided over tremendously difficult stories.
Okay, so everybody was just that incredible, it was an incredible privilege. sitting, presiding, and really being humbled by the incredible magnanimity, the generosity of spirit.
Forgiveness. When you sat in that Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you hear your own people sobbing and telling you stories of their own torture, of the loss of their loved ones. How do you start? How would you tell somebody how to start to forgive?
Well, we didn't have to tell them. We, as I say, had the privilege of sitting there and listening to the stories. And people generally moved on because there is something therapeutic about telling your story. It's that you are being acknowledged. You are not a cipher. You are someone, and that is something that says, yes, the suffering that you underwent was not just something that said poof into the sky. It contributed to the freedom we are now enjoying.
Okay, well, hopefully that gives you a good glimpse into a lot of what was going on in the heart of what was there. I just want to pull out a few ideas to take with us before we bring something else into kind of contrasting. So you see that there's still tremendous wounds, right, after the decades of structural institutionalized violence, racism, discrimination, to outright violence, right? And that those wounds would fester. And that ultimately they may lead, and probably would lead, according to their estimations, right, to more conflict, more violence, more injustice, and ultimately more of a denial of the sanctity of human life and dignity. And all of that's lost. That's lost. But in order to actually affirm, promote, and try to heal, right, human beings, that it's important for us to actually take on the hard challenge of forgiveness, right? Because reconciliation, the Latin roots to it actually mean to look eyelash to eyelash, right? So to be able to look into the window of someone's soul means you got to be good with one another in order to do that authentically, right? And there's a challenge and a vulnerability on our own part in that piece where we expose ourselves as much as to the other. And some of the things I wanted to pull out that were really crucial is the power of stories, right? The need for people to tell their stories. The fact that they focused on, we want to hear from the little people, right? That Desmond Tutu was saying. But more or less, what are these? That, right? The least, in the gospel, talks about the least of our brothers and sisters. Those who are the most marginalized, the most forgotten. Those whose suffering is never brought into account. And maybe even on the political stage, absolutely has no weight because they're not really persons, right? They're not even acknowledged as full members of society. But what I found so fascinating about it is that not only was it necessary for them for 22,000 people to give statements of an account, they had the bravery to bring this forward and just sort of state the matter of fact, but not necessarily, I don't know how many engaged in outright accusations and tried to reignite some conflict, but to put that out there was a part of what they needed for their healing. But what's interesting is it's also a part of what, on the social sphere, right? Our greater macro sense of our interconnectedness, our communal relations, our communal sense of identity. For South Africa to be healed as a nation, for the institutions to go on doing the very best they could to deal with the past, those stories needed to take place publicly. The truth needed to be confronted out in the open, in the air, so that it was acknowledged on the social, political, communal scale, right? So even for personal healing, that was something that was necessary. And another thing that was really significant that I think I pulled out of that, and I think we should hone in on, is that it was a government agenda operation initiative, and Desmond Tutu was kind of asked not to wear his clerical robes because it was government, right? We're not going to bring religion necessarily into this. And everyone kind of felt that way. Yes, let's not bring religion into this political ordeal. And we have that same kind of thinking in our own country for good reasons or ill. But what he comes back, he says that, well, the people wanted it. So there's this recognition of something that we talked about in September about the nature of a religious servant leader. And remember what religion broken down as a word was? Do you remember what the word was? What does it mean? To rebind. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the people had a sense that their religious leaders needed to be there because something about religious institutions being at their very best is something that rebinds and heals us. And that a prophetic figure with prophetic ideas that come from these countercultural traditions that are so powerful that challenge us, like Tutu, right? That with those ideas, if they're implemented, it's really a means to healing. It's not easy, it's not over and done with, but it's an ongoing process. But nonetheless, the most justice was done so that right relationship could be restored. And that's not the typical way our nations or institutions address justice, right? About restoring and rebinding and bringing us back into right relationship with one another. So what we have is that is without a doubt a benchmark in history of something to be pointed to and looked to as an example of how to respond prophetically, right, in the midst of conflict. But there's also certain things that allow that to take place. And so what we're going to do now is Jenna's going to help us transition a little bit into Irene, where we can take another look at what it means to respond to our prophetic call in the midst of conflict.
So basically, what we're doing today is looking at two figures, not just as figures, not just a story about teaching the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but also as case studies in a larger question of how to engage in resistance. So a couple things that are to pull out of that, I think, to help illustrate this question in this example of a case study is the first is that they were going through a transition period in which they needed to confront the past and to move forward. So Tutu was responding to the violence of a structure. Apartheid was violent not only in terms of physical violence, but also in terms of a structural sin which oppresses and cut off people's ability to be fully human. So there's a structure of violence, and the end of apartheid creates a break in that structure and a moment in which Tutu and the commission can move into it and decide whether they want to continue with that structure or reshape it in a different direction. And so they chose to reshaping it by pursuing justice through healing and relationship, with an emphasis on humanity and community rather than an emphasis on penalization, punity, and kind of a balanced system of accounting. In making that shift, they decided that the primary need was to respond to suffering rather than to respond to the need for like a punitive justice. So the thought is that through attending to suffering, people feel a sense of justice because the healing is done not only on an individual, but a communal level in the public space. So what happens is when they look at a broken structure and re-engage it in a new direction, they do so in terms of defining justice on the basis of restored relationships. They've kind of restructured the heart of what their society holds as valuable. And it's important not only because it promotes healing, but also because the sense of restored relationship creates a sense of interhuman connection. And it's in that sense of disconnection and isolation that it becomes easy to tolerate the violence that we do to one another. But the more we're connected, the more we see each other as people being integral to each other and our own humanity. So I think that's kind of what we'll tease out.
Okay, all right, great. I'm Irene. I don't know how I'm going to attach this to me because I don't have like a pocket. So if I put it here, I'm sure I'm going to walk away. It's going to fall. So when that happens, you can laugh. It's okay. Let me see what I can do with this. Try that. I'm going old school with a few notes on newsprint. I don't know if you guys can see it over there. Can you guys see it? It's on that silver bathroom thing.
Do you want me to stand and hold it for you?
No, not that one. Maybe the next one. Because that one only says who is Che Guevara. All right, so I thought I would begin by telling you, by first asking you, how many of you have thought enough about the issues of when to use violence that you would consider yourself a pacifist? Somebody who would never do something violent, no matter what was done to you. Have any of you thought enough through that to be able to make a stand? Who here would say they're a pacifist? So we have at least one. It's a hard thing to think through, so don't be afraid. I'd be proud of it. But you're not sure. Yeah, it's complicated. How many people here definitely feel that there's a time when some kind of force might be needed and justified? Okay. All right. Well, to give you an idea of who I am, I started out in college, and it was during the 80s when everybody was against the nuclear weapons, okay? So I was totally no nukes, brought speakers to campus, worked for the peace movement, and definitely considered myself a pacifist. I worked against the death penalty, and one of my favorite posters that I used to make was, why do we kill people? To show people that killing people is wrong. Because again, I thought killing people is always wrong, even if it's the death penalty. There's no case, no matter how bad somebody is, that they deserve to be killed by us. So I was a very strong pacifist. Then I go to Nicaragua in 1999 to see a former student who's in Jesuit Volunteer Corps. And I get to meet a bunch of people, and they had a very, very ugly war there, revolution. And I hear story after story of violence, and I mean violence like on this level. A young man was captured by the guerrilla forces, and his head was cut off, and they played soccer with it. Okay, so not just killing people in self-defense, but I'm talking about some kind of brutality. Something that goes beyond anything you could think of as justifiable, a total and complete disregard for human life. And I kept hearing stories like this about what had happened during their war. And one day I was out walking with someone who works with the kids who live on the street. He had a really big cross on. And he told me he had fought in the revolution. And I said to him, but you wear a cross. How did you reconcile the idea of killing people with the fact that you're a Christian? Didn't you think that that was wrong? And he said, it's a luxury for you to be a pacifist because you don't have anybody with a gun to your family's head. And I never had thought of it in those terms before. It's a luxury, it's a privilege for me to say I'm a pacifist because it's easy. Because my government, my society is stable enough that I can take that position because I probably don't ever have to worry that that's going to happen. So that night I called my parents. People do call their parents even when they're 40. But I called my parents and I'm like, I don't think I'm a pacifist anymore. I think there might actually be times when, there's a just use of force. And they were really worried. They're like, oh my God, you're sitting in fatigues with a gun there, aren't you? What are you doing there in Nicaragua? They were so worried. But that has been something that's troubled me since then. So this was a hard talk when Jenna and Will asked me to do it because I struggle with this issue, and to have to talk about Che was hard because of what his history was like. So why don't we start? So now you know a little bit about me and where I am in this. Pacifist who's questioning. Who was Che Guevara? Do you guys know who? Just your first sort of impulses. Like, here's a big book that came out in the 90s, the 40th anniversary of his death. All right, big book. There's tons of them about him. There's buttons you can buy. There's T-shirts. Che, there we go. Okay. Anybody know who he is? Cuban. Right, that's part of it. Revolutionary. Part of it. He was a physician. He was a physician, yes, he was a doctor. From Argentina, perfect, got it. Okay. Oh, guerrilla tactician, he wrote a book on guerrilla warfare. Yes, he did. Okay. A lot of people think he's extreme. How many people would say you think he's violent? And he was. There's aspects of that. But I want to present him today as a very complicated figure. Okay? So just take this part off. Yeah. And then you can hang it there, because it's only simple. It's more for me so that I remember what I'm going to tell you. So anyway, when he was a student, he was like a middle-class student in Argentina, very much like you guys and like I once was. And he went to med school, but during med school he took like some time off and almost did a break trip. His version of a break trip. How many people have seen the movie Motorcycle Diaries? Okay. What he did is he traveled around South America on a motorcycle with his best friend. And traveling that way, he talks about this in his writings, he came into contact with miners, extremely poor people. He stayed for a while since he was in med school at a leper colony, helping out the doctors there. He saw poverty at its worst, and there was so much of it, and continues to be in South America, all of Latin America. And he was converted to the poor, I would say, in the way that I think it's Romero talks about it. Romero or Sobrino, can't remember which one, but converted to the poor. He was convinced that something needed to be done, and it was an urgent need. So here's some quotes from him, and here this very violent person. At the risk of sounding ridiculous, I believe that a true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love. If you tremble with indignation at every injustice, then you are a comrade of mine. This is somebody I think I might like. A real man should feel on his own cheek the blow inflicted on any other man's cheek. So the sympathy for the suffering of other people. So this is what drove him to want to do something to change the world. And this is the way he analyzed what was wrong with the world, okay? How would you, in here, what do you think the cause of poverty is here, if you had to say in a couple words? What's the cause of world poverty? Industry? Is that what you said? Yeah, I'm sorry, I might be deaf. All right. Greed and selfishness? It's a hard one, I know, yeah. Oppression? Yeah. Oppression, okay, yeah, that's right, I knew what you meant. Oh, so there you are, go ahead. Lack of education. Lack of education, okay. Disproportionate allocation of resources. Catholic Church talks about that. All right. He believed, like Gandhi, that poverty was the worst form of violence. So get your head around that concept for a minute. Here we're not talking about violence as hurting people with your gun or your hand. Here we're talking about hurting people through poverty. How does poverty hurt people? They're starving.
They have no hope of getting out of like the rock bottom of their life.
Right, they're hopeless.
They're always stressed, worried about day-to-day.
Right. Perfect. Right.
And it diminishes from dignity.
Right. Through all these ways, right. Somebody else have a hand up? Their medical, right? Exactly. Okay, so you're getting a sense of how poverty could be violence, how it could actually hurt people. And Gandhi said it was the worst form of violence, and potentially because it's the most pervasive. So Che had a different analysis of what causes poverty, though. He did think it was greed. You were right on that. And he did think it was selfishness, but he put it under a big word called imperialism. Who knows what imperialism is? I'm giving you all these hard questions. How do you solve poverty? What is imperialism?
It was like a mode of it was like, I can think of it better as in examples, but
Okay.
like imperialist countries set out to conquer other countries to use their resources to make their own economy better, like what England did with India or France with Algeria.
Perfect. That's exactly right. Anybody want to add to that? Yeah.
I've heard people describe it as almost like raping other countries
Right.
and taking their natural resources.
Right.
And leaving them with nothing.
Right.
It
Caitlin?
can also be forms of like cultural imperialism,
Right.
where you influence certain values and certain systems on others and oppressing others.
Right. So Che felt that imperialism was the cause of poverty. And by that, let me give you the example that was one of the examples in his lifetime, and it was the case of Cuba, what was happening in Cuba at that time in the 1950s. And this is what John F. Kennedy John F. Kennedy said, not his son, sorry, when he was president, about the situation in Cuba. He said it himself. At the beginning of 1959, United States companies owned about 40% of the Cuban sugar production. They owned almost all the cattle ranches, 90% of the mines, and 80% of utilities, and they owned practically all of the oil resources in Cuba. In addition to owning all of what Cuba had as its natural resources, it also imported 2/3 of their products. So it created a dependency of this country on the United States, and by importing products, you're also importing culture. So I don't know if you've been to other countries, but if you go any place, let's say in Central America, you'll see a Sunoco, and it'll say, on the run, like one of those little stores that's at the Sunoco where you get a Coke, on the run, or there's Pizza Hut, or there's Wendy's. That's us importing our culture, importing our businesses for our well-being as a country, to make more money, rather than supporting their businesses and their companies. So that's what imperialism is. And Che felt very strongly that imperialism was the cause of poverty, and what was happening in Cuba was incredibly unjust. So he moves to Mexico and he meets Fidel Castro. Who's Fidel Castro? This should be an easy one, right? All right, somebody. Put my glasses on because somebody's raising their hand. All right, Fidel.
The Cuban dictator.
Perfect, okay. At the time, though, he wasn't. He was a recent college graduate, gotten his law degree, was really upset with what was happening in Cuba because he thought it was incredibly unjust, just like Che did, and tried to run for public office and get democratically elected. And what happened? The elections get aborted, and a coup takes over by a dictator named Batista. He decides, I don't want to go through this election process. I'm just going to use my military force. He was connected to the military, and I'm just going to make myself the president of Cuba. So Fidel gets put into exile in Mexico, meets Che. It was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. A friendship that was definitely going to change things. To make a long story short, they collaborated together, but Che at this point is still very concerned about poverty and wanting to change it. He agrees to go with Fidel to Cuba with Fidel's forces, but he's going to be the doctor. He's not a soldier, he's going to be the medic. But when he gets there and they go into battle and he sees his friends getting killed around him, that's the moment of his decision to change from just wanting to help with the medical end of things, and he takes up a gun. And that's when he became not just a revolutionary, but a revolutionary who uses, because I think you could be a revolutionary for sure, and in a peaceful way, like Nelson Mandela and Tutu, but he takes up a gun because he sees that there's no way to make change in this country without taking up forces. That's what he perceives as a reality. So, just so you don't think they were completely off the continuum of like radical, John F. Kennedy again says this. I believe, this is about Cuba, right before the revolution. I believe there is no country in the world, and by that I mean all the countries under colonial domination, there's no country in the world where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation are worse than in Cuba. And in part owing to my country's, the US's, policies during the Batista regime. So he's taking some responsibility for why things aren't just in Cuba. Batista had murdered, he says, 20,000 Cubans in 7 years. He had taken what was a democratic country and created a police state, destroying individual liberty, so controlling the press, not allowing people to talk about the dictator without being put in jail, without being tortured, without their bodies literally being hung from the telephone poles after they had been killed, to create a feeling of terror in the country. And he says that the United States spokesman publicly praised Batista, hailed him as a staunch ally and a friend at a time when he was murdering thousands and destroying the last vestiges of freedom. And we failed to press for free elections. We as the United States failed to press for free elections. Now, we're not always the bad guy, but he was saying in this situation, we were the bad guy. And one of the social critics at the time, Arthur Schlesinger, said this. He said, the conditions in Cuba, the brutality of the police, the indifference to the people's need for education, medical care, housing, is an open invitation for revolution. So they saw what was happening, what was probably going to happen, just because of the conditions. And they thought, not that they supported it, but they thought it was a likely outcome. So, to sum it up, they over the course of 3 years, roughly 3 years, they engage in the revolution, they win, they take over the country. Che decides, I don't want to be a bureaucrat. I'll get the literacy campaign started. The first book he had published as the head of the literacy campaign was Don Quixote, because he would do readings of that when they were up in the mountains with the peasants who were the soldiers, because he thought it was so important for the people to be educated so that they could also be participants in the government and the society once they did have freedom and once the revolution won. So all of this started out with the best of intentions, but as some people and as Christians, we may say this went terribly, terribly in the wrong direction because people were killed. So the three questions I would say, just the end of his life, he died at 39 in Bolivia. He was helping with the revolution there. He was murdered by Bolivian forces that were backed by the CIA forces. So, because he was seen as a threat, because he was good at this, unfortunately. So he saw, in his mind, with all his concern for humanity, that he thought it was legitimate to take up arms. So this leaves me with questions. Well, first, an observation. We belong to a church. I didn't talk about, just war. Oh, no problem. We can potentially talk about that. I don't know how much time we have. But we belong to a church and a country that's more like Che than Tutu, really. We take up arms to achieve what we want in many situations. We think that's legitimate. We belong to a church that in some ways has also taken up arms in the past, but supports a policy that I think we need to look at of just war, that in some cases it is okay to go to war. And I'm going to pass around what they say, what our church says is the criteria. I didn't mean to wake you up. The criteria for engaging in violence. And what's really significant about this is that it started with the thought of Augustine and then was developed further by Aquinas. And then the US bishops wrote about it, and then they even included it in the Catholic Catechism that came out. It was under John Paul II, right? The new catechism? I have a copy of it, don't you? I know I do, somewhere, but anyway. So, to go over this in a really quick way, if you're going to do something in a just way to engage in war, there has to be a just cause. So it can't be to punish people, sort of like when Will was talking about Desmond Tutu. You know, you don't go to war and then to hurt all the people who had tortured other people, you know, in revenge. You don't do that. Innocent life must be in imminent danger, and there must be an intervention to protect life. So there has to be a just cause. Comparative justice, there has to be, if you have to weigh the two sides, there's greater potential for life lost on this side than there is on this side, so you want to protect the greatest number of people. A competent authority, you don't want just some random group of people deciding they're going to go to war. You want it to be a legitimate authority. In the case of the Cuban Revolution, there was no legitimate authority. The dictator had taken power illegally, so I think all bets are off on who was a competent authority in that situation. Right intention, probability of success, so not undertaking something you know is going to be end in disaster. Like if we had known what was going to happen with the Vietnam War, I don't think we would have gone into it. And force must be used as an absolute last resort for it to be considered just. You must have exhausted every other way of resolving the conflict. And then there's a few other categories. And the second part of it here is, if you do engage in war, how should you do it? That you can look over yourself. But I thought it was important that you at least had this, so you saw the thought that went into deciding. So a question this brings up for me is, should our church be a pacifist church based on the witness of Jesus? That's the church I thought I belonged to until I learned more about just war theory when I was younger. I thought it was a pacifist church because of Jesus. So that's always been a question I've struggled with. So I think I'll leave it there and turn it over to Jenna to facilitate some questions or discussion. Sound good? Okay.
So that's a hard act to follow.
Just ask a lot of questions.
I know, right? So basically what we wanted to do for a quick second is to just draw out some of the similarities and differences in the context between Tutu and Che. Because what we've kind of done is held up stereotypical, like, good guy, bad guy images. And we kind of did that as a false dichotomy because the whole thing is that they're operating under very different circumstances, which kind of put different options, perimeters, restrictions on the way in which they can move forward. So we talked a little bit about the overarching things with South Africa, moving out of apartheid. A couple of things I think to note, looking at Cuba and the revolution there, Che said that revolutionaries don't create violence. They're responding to a violence that already exists with the burden of figuring out how to interrupt it. So Che was also, like Tutu, responding to a structure of violence: death, poverty, oppression, fear, torture, imperialism. However, there was no break in the structure that Che was trying to engage. He was looking at a violence that has played out and that continued to play out within a structure that was overarching and pervasive. So whereas Tutu saw the end of apartheid and a gap to be filled, Che is looking at something that is ongoing and all-encompassing and trying to figure out how to interrupt it. And so he's faced with the reality of disrupting the structure from within instead of redefining a structure during a period of transition. And he has to look carefully at the reality of a brutal structure and reckon with the question of how to disrupt violence and repression and how to navigate the use of potential force in there, knowing that lives are currently being lost. Tutu was also in a situation where there had been a lot of death, but that had kind of come to an end in the moment with the end of apartheid, and it was how to reclaim and restore people's lives moving forward. Che is looking at a situation where people are currently dying, and how do you navigate the question of what is an acceptable loss of life, and how do you define that for other people. So a couple just key contrasts. Both were working against overarching structures of violence. Both were acting not only as individuals, but also as a member and a protector of a community, which places different burdens and considerations on their question of engagement. Both were responding to the felt needs of their community, but Tutu was responding to a violence that had occurred, and Che was looking at a violence that was continuously occurring. Not to oversimplify a situation, which I just oversimplified. Tutu was creating a new structure over and against a previous one, while Che was looking at interrupting the current structure. Tutu was responding to suffering from lives already lost, whereas Che was surrounded by the constant presence of death throughout the process. And so the reason why we bring that up isn't to put one up as like the right way or the wrong way, or to come to a determination about them, but I think to raise the question of what is the reality that which we're contending, and how does history and context matter every time in looking at that reality, and what are the different roles that we play and have to navigate when coming to those kind of decisions. So, do you guys have any initial thoughts, questions, statements to offer?
I'm just really glad you brought that up, because I was like, oh, well, they're different situations completely, so, thanks for bringing up the other side of the story.
There are also different sides to it. I haven't had a teacher here. She's still a teacher here. She's like 85 years old, and she's originally from Cuba. And her name is Estrella Ogden. And she worked as Che Guevara's secretary for 10 years. And she would talk on the phone with really big, crazy people like Castro and things. And she got out right before Castro took over because her family had money. But if you ask her, what do you think about what's going on with Cuba and everything? She's like, oh, they know what they're doing. Everything's great up there. They're treating everybody awesome. I wish I could vacation there and all this stuff. And you're like, oh, okay, but there's a lot of different viewpoints. You have to see it. From the people who were around him, she looked up to him. And she was like, oh, he was a great man. He died too young. They destroyed him in Bolivia. It was unfair and all this stuff. But sitting there, standing with him, you might get a different perspective than just oh, he was horrible because of blah, looking back is different than being in the moment.
He did say those wonderful things, but he also said, essentially you have to be a killing machine in order to, in his guerrilla warfare manual, in order to overthrow a government. So he did say some things that are horribly brutal and violent. So it's a really complicated picture.
In his book too, the guerrilla warfare book, I like the way he wrote. He wrote straight to the point, and he talked about how during the war, it's not the difference between a terrorism group and just a group of bandits, and being a guerrilla, part of the guerrilla army, is that bandits, yes, they're against the government, but that they're not for the people either. They're kind of looking out for their self-interest. And he said, as a guerrilla, part of the guerrillas people's army, you have to be listening to the people and what the people respond. And a lot of his guerrilla warfare tactics evolved around knowing the community they could take them to the person's homes, and it had to do with what was favorable ground versus unfavorable ground. So, but he talked about the people a lot in the work.
I think that's why he's sort of a figure for so many people of inspiration, and then for other people of art, is because he did have some really good ideas and principles, but also this other side. Yeah.
I was just gonna say also, I think it's a big deal that we should see how others see us, especially today in this country. Like my mom's Bolivian, and when she was going to school, she's like, I never want to go to America. They killed all of the Indians, they killed all the black people, they're horrible people. How could they do that and all this stuff? And it was she was completely against us. And we need to see other countries, how they see us, how they see our history, how they see whether we have just left the poison in the wounds, sort of, of people in the past. We have to see how other people might see us and how we impact their lives, even if we aren't always conscious of it.
I was going to say, it's interesting that you brought up imperialism, because a lot of the Latin American countries see the conquest, not just from the Spanish and Portugal and British, as the first conquest, but then there was a second conquest, and that was the United States. And at first, the United States tried to do it politically, socially, and economically, sending troops to El Salvador to protect their interests, which were a lot of businesses and stuff. You see it in Panama politically with bombings, and you see it in a lot of different Latin American countries that they send CIA operatives or different stuff. So that was but slowly, people stood up against that, and that's been taken away. But economically, the U.S. still has a huge, even with NAFTA, which is supposed to be seen as a great free trade agreement, still has dependency on U.S. trade and exports, for a lot of Latin American countries.
I didn't mean to paint the U.S. as a terrible place, although in this situation there were critical elements of it, but I agree with you on what you're saying. It does have a very messy history in this hemisphere.
It still does.
Yeah.
And the Cold War complicates a lot of that. Those are some. There's a lot of atrocities and things that the United States were taking part in. The rationale, kind of protecting the free world. And I grew up in some of that. My family and dad. I understand that changes a lot of the dynamic. That if you aren't raised with the threat of a nuclear bomb coming off, tomorrow potentially, that you don't necessarily understand how that changes the way the politics work. And there are a lot of things that were done as a result of and in the context of that Cold War. But that's not to excuse or necessarily even try to explain fully. But that's definitely a strong factor, and I think we think about enough. And look at how the U.S. is tied in to a lot of the things we've brought up so far in this semester.
And I think it plays out not just on an international scale, but in our own individual experiences, which is something that we really wanted to look at with this topic. Because I think it's really easy to say Jay, and nonviolent, yay, but I think that sometimes those are very easy things to fall into without having to really reconcile what does it mean to take those positions, and how do different situations cause us to act in different ways, even though we might not necessarily have ever imagined ourselves going down that path. And I think something that's really interesting was just at a lecture recently with Irene, and it was this military ethicist talking. And basically he was talking about how nonviolence and pacifism, there's, we were talking with prophets, to be prophetic is to invite conflict and to invite violence into your life and your experience, and to be able to recognize and own that as a decision that you're committed to, and how, a commitment to nonviolence to the end of martyrdom is one of the hardest and most noble things that you can do. But it has to be an individual decision, because it has to be something that you own. Otherwise, it's sacrifice or slaughter. It's not martyrdom or commitment to nonviolence. That comes with a decision and an integrity behind that decision. And so that's only something that can really play out on an individual level, because only an individual and yourself can decide if that's where your commitment is. So while you might be committed on an individual level to certain ideals, what happens then when you become responsible for other people? When you're the leader and representative of the community, you can't necessarily decide for that community in favor of a nonviolence that leads to death, because that's not a choice for them. There's people who do not choose that and do not have the ability, you're talking about kids, to make that decision. And then in that case, what, are you reckoning with a situation of sacrifice or slaughter? And so he brought up the idea of also the duty to protect when you're responsible for a larger community and their well-being. And he actually pulled on Augustine to talk about it in terms of the duty to protect as a responsibility to charity. And where is Christian charity kind of carve out a space for that kind of protection as well. So it's just the idea that it's complicated, and I think it brings really nicely with a quote that I already pulled out from Derek Jensen. And he says that every morning, he's an environmental activist, he says, every morning when I wake up, I ask myself whether I should write or blow up a dam. I tell myself I should keep writing, though I'm not sure that's right. I don't know if any of you guys have ever kind of felt a similar struggle, depending on to what degree, the question of how do you witness, testify, engage, act, respond to something in hopes of actually making an impact.
You feel like this is challenged today? Challenging kind of discussion in some way? Right, it's kind of difficult to reach a resolution there. It's somewhat the point, in a way, so to be responsible to the complexity, right? Because what we tend to do here is we really do, especially espousing our Christian identity at the university, hold up nonviolence and Jesus as a model. But it's not just always as easy as that. As one group was saying, you have to resist the idea of fetishizing nonviolence as if it's just a thing to do, and recognizing sometimes it comes out of a place of privilege. We have the privilege of having a certain context that allows us that option. And not to say that we wouldn't choose for ourselves still to be nonviolent, but to look at the realities that are there. In some ways, it's very difficult for us in our daily lives to connect with. Well, there are people in our country that do it every day. And so I think that if there's one thing I want to leave out there, and this too is something that's broader than it just communicates, but I think is powerful. I was at a speaker recently in which this Derek Jensen guy was on the panel, and another one was this gentleman, George Lakey, whose group was the one that was supposed to be leading us in our workshop 2 Fridays ago, but that didn't work out. It's a nonviolence training workshop. And down at Swarthmore College, they've done a database of all of this nonviolent history. And there's these academics who have done a study of all of the recorded regime changes in history. How many were successful given nonviolent means versus violent means? Do you guys want to take a guess at that? Like, even percentage-wise or whatever? Which one's more?
Successful and successful in what way?
The regime changed. So sometimes you can have movements that change a culture, but the actual people in power are still the same individuals, they've just adapted, right? But this is a regime change. That's the bottom line.
And you're looking in terms of percentages?
Well, I'm just trying to
Just
find
because I don't think nonviolence is tried as often, frequently.
Tried as frequently, right, yeah. It's, okay. Anyone else? I think, see, that's more the nuance we need to look at. But the statistic is that when nonviolence was the mean to change, say with Gandhi or even King was a regime change, but it was successful 52% of the time. When violence was the actual action that led to a successful regime change, and I could be off by a percentage point or so here, but it's basically 23% of the time. So what we take out of that is not a really quick and simple nonviolence is always better, right? But even the people at the discussion panel were trying to say, this really does make an argument that you really got to give nonviolence a chance. But given the two scenarios we kind of played out today, you understand it's more complex than that, right? Is there the option for nonviolence? How often is it really tried? Are most of the needs for full regime change in such unstable, unjust societies that it's only the extreme ends that really are used or able to be used? But that's I guess my way of trying to add a little bit of encouragement to the end of this challenging question today is the sense that there are studies that show this is still the path to try to always choose, and there's data behind that.
So if we want to
Sorry, Ash, had a question?
Oh, I just wanted to chime in.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I agree that non-violence is always like an option that people can use, but you know, a lot of people want like the fast way out. Just want, you know, to get the best way possible in order to achieve what they want. And you have the possibility of using nonviolence, but those who are usually in power or those who represent people sometimes manipulate, like justify using violence in order to get what they want. Like we see those groups. It also depends on like what side you're in. Like for example, we see groups that have attacked U.S. forces in Iraq as terrorists, these monsters, suicide bombers, horrible people. But the other group sees them as almost like freedom fighters. And so it really depends on what side you're in.
Well, should we give our presentation to you?